King Haakon the Good is remembered by history as the first Christian monarch of Norway. Though the land was still pagan when he ascended the throne, his reign left an enduring legacy of justice, compassion, and wisdom. So cherished was he by his people that he earned the lasting title the Good. As the youngest son of Harald Fairhair, Haakon was never destined to rule, yet fate chose him, and through his fairness, compassion, and wise laws, he won the hearts of the Norwegians. At his death, it was said that Norway would never see his like again. This is his story. Haakon was born in the year 920, the youngest son of Harald Fairhair, the first king of a unified Norway. Remarkably, Harald sired him at the age of 70, with his mother being Thora Modstertong, a woman renowned for her beauty and sturdy bearing. As Haakon grew, he was said to be strikingly handsome and of an impressive stature, bearing a strong resemblance to his father. At this time, King Ethelstan ruled over England, having achieved a unification of the land, much like Harald had done in Norway. Ethelstan, often called the Victorious, sought to assert his supremacy over neighbouring realms. In a bold gesture meant to establish dominance over Norway, he sent emissaries to King Harald, bearing a lavishly adorned sword, its hilt decorated with gold and silver. When Harald accepted the sword, the messengers declared, "Now thou hast taken the sword according to our king's desire, and therefore art thou his subject, as thou hast taken this sword." These words were a cunning political maneuver, implying submission. Harald, a wise and proud ruler, recognized the insult, but chose not to retaliate. He allowed the envoys to return to England unharmed, keenly aware of the game Ethelstan was playing. Harald, ever prudent, began to worry for the future of his youngest son. With many elder sons already grown and power-hungry, Haakon's position in Norway was precarious. To protect him, and perhaps turn Ethelstan's gambit to his own advantage, Harald devised a clever plan. He sent the young Haakon escorted by warriors to Ethelstan's court in England. Upon their arrival, Harald's men boldly approached the English king and placed the boy on Ethelstan's knee. By this act, Ethelstan was compelled to become the boy's foster father. Though reluctant, Ethelstan agreed. When word reached Harald, he was well pleased, for it was widely held that fostering another man's child placed one in a position of lesser prestige. In this subtle game of honour and pride, each king has sought to prove himself the greater, yet neither diminished the other. Each remained sovereign and esteemed in his own land until his death. Thus, Haakon came of age in the royal court of Ethelstan, England's first true king, and perhaps one of its greatest. There, the young Norwegian prince was baptized and raised in the Christian faith. He grew into a man admired by all, noble in character, gracious in manner, and deeply devout. He was gifted in poetry as a skald, and known for his towering strength, radiant beauty, and sharp intellect. His speech was eloquent, his wisdom apparent, and his bearing kingly. By the time King Harald of Norway reached the age of 80, his body had grown heavy with age, and he was no longer able to travel the breadth of his kingdom, nor attend to the burdens of kingship. Recognizing that his time drew near, he summoned his son Eric to the high seat, and bestowed upon him the rule and governance of the realm. In the year 933, King Harald Fairhair passed from this world, and with his death, the true struggle for Norway began. The many sons of Harald, each harbouring ambition, now vied for dominion over their share of the land and its riches. Though Eric was acknowledged as the High King above all of his brothers, he was far from content, for rivalry simmered among them. Some of them would go to war, and in the following year of 934, two of Eric's brothers Sigfrid and Olaf fell in battle, their names forever lost to the silence of an unnamed field. It was by Eric's own hand that they died, and for this bloodshed, he became known as Bloodaxe. Eric Bloodaxe was a man of imposing presence, strong, broad-shouldered, and strikingly handsome. He was hailed as a fearless warrior and a fortunate commander in battle, yet his virtues ended on the battlefield, for in nature he was dark of mood, curt in speech, and harsh in temper. He inspired fear more than loyalty. His queen, Gunhild, was said to be the fairest of women, clever, learned, and full of energy. Yet beneath her beauty lay a heart of cruelty and guile. Deceitful and ruthless, she was widely mistrusted and feared. Together, Eric and Gunhild came to be loathed by the common folk of Norway. Their rule brought unrest and darkness to the land. Meanwhile, far away across the sea, the youngest son of Harald Fairhair, Haakon, remained quietly forgotten in the court of King Ethelstan of England, unaware that his time would soon come. Haakon, the foster son of King Ethelstan, was in England when word reached him of his father's death. He was but 14 years of age, yet upon hearing the news, he wasted no time. With a heart stirred by destiny, he prepared to return to the land of his birth. King Ethelstan, who had come to love the young prince, gave him noble companions, fine ships, and all the provisions needed for a king's voyage. Thus, in the season of harvest, Haakon set sail for Norway. Upon arriving, he learned not only of his father's passing, but also of the deaths of his brothers. His eldest brother, Eric Bloodaxe, now ruled in the Viken. Wasting no time, Haakon sailed northward to the region of Trondelag, where he sought the counsel of Sigurd, the Earl of Lade, the wisest and most powerful chieftain in Norway. Sigurd welcomed Haakon with open arms, and the two entered into a solemn alliance. Together, they summoned a great thing, the ancient Germanic assembly of freemen and chieftains. At the thing, Earl Sigurd stood and spoke first, praising Haakon's lineage and wisdom, and urging the people to accept him as their rightful king. Then Haakon himself rose to speak. Those who listened whispered to one another in wonder, saying, "Harald Fairhair has returned young again, and full grown." Haakon humbly offered himself to the people. He sought not only the title of king, but their aid and loyalty in defending the realm. In return, he made a bold and generous promise. He offered to restore to every man the ancient Udal rights to his land, rights that had been taken by his father. Under this law, every man would be the true and free owner of the soil he worked, owing fealty to no overlord. The response was thunderous. The people burst into cheers, hailing Haakon as their king. Thus, it was the men of Trondelag that chose the young prince to wear the crown. With a royal court, loyal guards, and devoted servants, his journey began through the land. Word of his rise spread swiftly, carried from tongue to tongue like fire across dry grass. The news would soon reach the uplands, where the people rejoiced to hear of a king who sought their freedom rather than their submission. Unlike Harald Fairhair, who made the land his own and reduced the people to vassals, Haakon sought to restore dignity and ownership to every freeman. Naturally, the hearts of the people turned to him for his fairness, compassion, and the just laws he introduced. They gave him a name that would echo through history: Haakon the Good. Meanwhile, hatred for King Eric only deepened. As love for Haakon grew, so too did the boldness among the people. They no longer feared to speak openly of their disdain for Eric's cruel rule. In the spring, King Haakon raised a great army in Trondelag and prepared his fleet for war. Even the men of the Viking, once loyal to Eric, now gathered to join Haakon's cause. Eric tried in vain to summon warriors from the heart of the country, but his efforts faltered. One by one, the great earls and chiefs abandoned him and turned to Haakon. Seeing himself hopelessly outmatched, Eric fled with the few men who remained faithful to him. He sailed west, first to the Orkney Islands, gathering men as he went, then south toward England. Along the way, he ravaged the coasts of Scotland and northern England, plundering where he could. And so it was that Eric Bloodaxe was driven into exile in Northumbria, while Haakon ascended to the throne of Norway in the year 934, a boy of just 14 years old, already a king in every sense of the word. According to the Heimskringla, King Ethelstan of England, mindful of his friendship with King Harald Fairhair, extended a generous offer to Eric, Harald's exiled son. He sent envoys bearing a message of goodwill, expressing that for the sake of Harald, whom he had long esteemed, that he would show kindness to his sons. Through the exchange of messengers, an agreement was reached. Eric would receive the kingdom of Northumbria as a fief, to hold and defend in Ethelstan's name against the Danes and other marauding Norsemen. As part of this accord, Eric agreed to accept baptism into the Christian faith, along with his wife, their children, and all the warriors who had followed him into exile, and so Eric Bloodaxe became the king of Northumbria. He ruled there from the years 947 until 948, where he was driven from power. Yet, fate returned him to the throne in the year 952. His second reign, however, was also short-lived. In the year 954, he was betrayed and slain by the northern lords of England in a cruel and treacherous plot. Far to the north, word of Eric's death soon reached King Haakon. He also learned that his brother's sons, disinherited and landless, had no foothold left in England. For a time, these sons turned to plundering the coasts of Scotland, seizing the taxes and treasures their father had once gathered as the king of Northumbria. But soon enough, their gaze shifted across the sea, northward to Norway, their ancestral home. And so, the shadow of blood and vengeance began to once more stir on the horizon of Haakon's reign. One summer, King Haakon journeyed to the region of Viken. In the days of the Viking Age, the Viken referred to the great strait that lay between Norway, the northwestern coast of Sweden, and the Jutland peninsula of Denmark. This vital crossroad, now part of southeastern Norway, was then considered the northmost outpost of the Danish dominion. In those troubled times, Danish raiders frequently descended upon the Viken, leaving devastation in their wake. But when word spread that King Haakon had arrived with a mighty host, the Danes hastily withdrew. Some fled south to Halland, while those nearest to the king's forces took to the sea, retreating across the waters to Jutland. When Haakon learned of their flight, he did not hesitate. With his entire army, he sailed after them, crossing into Danish lands. Upon reaching Jutland, he unleashed his fury, plundering the surrounding countryside. Alarmed by the invasion, the Danish farmers and freemen gathered in great numbers, determined to defend their homeland, and a mighty battle ensued. In the heart of the fight, King Haakon displayed unmatched courage. Casting aside both helmet and mail, he marched boldly before his banner, leading his men into the fray with fearless resolve. Victory was his, the enemy broke and fled. This was Haakon's first victory in war. Thus sung the skald Guthorm Sindri, in praise of Haakon's valour and triumph. Furrowing the deep blue sea with oars, the king pursues to Jutland's shores. They met, and in the battle storm of clashing shields, full many a form of godly warrior on the plain, full many a corpse by Haakon slain, glutted the ravens who from far, scenting the banquet feast of war, came in black flocks to Jutland's plains, to drink the blood wine from the veins. When King Haakon returned to Norway, he was already a devout Christian, having embraced the faith during his upbringing in the English court of King Ethelstan, but he soon found that his native land remained steeped in the old ways, rich with pagan rites and ancestral sacrifice. Knowing that both the loyalty of the great chieftains and the affection of the common people were essential to secure the realm, Haakon resolved to keep his Christian devotion a private matter. For a time, quietly, he began the work of conversion. He first sought to win over those closest to him, his friends, his most trusted men. Many, out of love for their king, consented to baptism. Some even ceased their offerings to the old gods. Haakon would take up residence in Trondelag, the heartland of Norway's power, and bided his time. When he believed the ground had been prepared, he sent word to England, requesting bishops and learned priests to bring the gospel in earnest. Upon their arrival, Haakon made his intentions known. He would proclaim Christianity throughout all of Norway. To do this, he called an assembly at the Frostathing, where freemen from across the region gathered to debate law and the crown. There, before the assembled bonds, the landholding farmers and freemen of the realm, King Haakon stood and spoke from the heart. He encouraged his people, both high and low, men and women, young and old, to receive baptism and embrace the faith in the one true God, Christ. He urged them to abandon the sacrifices to the false gods, to keep the seventh day holy, to cease from labour on that day, and to observe a fast. But as soon as the king's words fell upon the crowd, a great murmur rose like thunder from the gathered assembly. The bonds grumbled that their king wished to rob them not only of their toil, but also of their ancient faith. They protested that their lands could not be worked without meat, and that the fasts would weaken the hands of the labourers and slaves. They whispered among themselves that though Haakon and his kin were known to be generous with gold, they were sparing with food. Then stood Asbjorn, a powerful chieftain from Trondelag, and he spoke boldly. King Haakon, when we chose thee to be our king, and regained our Udal rights at the Thing in Trondelag, we believed ourselves to have entered a new golden age, but we no longer know if we are truly free, by stripping us of the ancient faith that our fathers and forefathers held in the highest regard. Those mighty men were no less brave than we, and their gods served them well. We have held thee dear, and have allowed thee to rule and make laws for the whole land, and we shall still follow thee, and call thee our king, for as long as a single bond draws breath in this thing. But thou must show us some moderation, demand only which we can, and in good faith obey. But if thou would force this upon us, then know this: we have resolved to set thee aside, and find another chief who will govern us in a manner suited to our customs and conscience. So now, King Haakon, thou must choose between these paths before this thing is ended. The crowd roared their approval. The The words of Asbjorn were as their own, and the people swore to stand or fall by them. When silence returned, Earl Sigurd of Lade stood and addressed the assembly. "It is the king's will," he said, "to yield to the bonds, and to never sever the bond of friendship between ruler and people." The bonds replied that it was their desire that the king should offer a sacrifice for peace and a good year, as his father Harald Fairhair would do. However, Haakon refused, to the disappointment of his people. Later, Earl Sigurd came to Haakon in private and counselled him. "It would be unwise, my lord, to defy the will of the people. Let it be for now. We may yet find a wiser road forward." And the king, though grieved, agreed to bide his time. In the pagan ceremonies that followed, Haakon would attend out of obligation, but never would take part in the sacred rites. Most notably, he refused to eat the horseflesh, the clearest sign of devotion to the old gods. This drew anger from some of the earls, who went as far as to threaten him with violence if he would not make a sacrifice. Yet, through all this, Earl Sigurd remained Haakon's shield and mediator, standing between the Christian king and the fury of the pagan lords. And so, in this fragile peace between faiths, the seeds of Norway's future were sown. The sons of King Eric had returned from Denmark and descended upon the region of Viken, laying waste to the land and plundering far and wide. Their coming stirred unrest across the kingdom, and so King Haakon, resolute and unshaken, gathered his forces to confront his nephews in open battle. Among them stood Guthorm, the eldest son of Eric, who bore the title of king and led his men with pride. Upon the field, beneath fluttering banners and the roar of steel, the two forces clashed. In the thick of the fray, King Haakon met Guthorm face to face, and a fierce and fateful duel ensued. With sword in hand, Haakon struck Guthorm down. The young king fell, slain by his own uncle's hand, and his standard, the proud symbol of his claim, was torn from the field. Around him, many warriors perished, their blood watering the earth. With their leader fallen and their ranks broken, the sons of Eric turned to flight. They fled in haste to their ships, pursued by the wrath of Haakon's men, and many were cut down before they reached the safety of the sea. Those who survived rowed desperately away, their numbers greatly diminished and their pride wounded. A song recounts the battle. The king's voice waked the silent host, who slept beside the wild sea coast, and bade the song of spear and sword over the battle plain be heard, where heroes' shields the loudest rang, where loudest was the sword blade's clang. By the seashore, at calmed sound, Haakon felled Guthorm to the ground. After his victory, King Haakon returned north to Norway, while the sons of Eric remained for a long time in Denmark. There, they turned again to their seafaring ways, raiding along the coasts of the Baltic, and at times even landing in Norway to plunder. Yet, so long as Haakon sat upon the throne, the realm knew peace and prosperity. The seasons were kind, the harvests were good, and the people held their king in deepest affection. Few monarchs were more beloved than Haakon the Good. But in the year of 954, after nearly 20 years of peace, the sons of Eric returned once more, this time not as wandering raiders, but with a mighty host. Their army was vast, composed not only of their own hardened warriors, but also a great multitude of Danes sent by their uncle King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark. For through their mother Gunhild, known to all as the Mother of Kings, they were kin to Danish royalty, with her being the daughter of Gorm the Old. When news of this great force reached King Haakon, he summoned his council. His men were few compared to the enemy, and the question weighed heavily. Should they stand and fight, or fall back and gather their strength? Then rose Egil Ulserk, a warrior long in years but unbending in spirit. Once a mighty champion of King Harald Fairhair, he had borne the king's banner into many battles, and had never known defeat. Stern and resolute he declared, "I fought for King Harald in 100 fields, and never once did he ask if flight was wise. He stood and fought, and he conquered. Let us not shame his blood now by speaking of retreat." His words stirred in the hearts of the gathered warriors, and at last Haakon himself was moved. He gave his voice to battle. Egil, old though he was overjoyed. "Peace has lasted so long," he said, "that I feared I might die the slow death of age. Now I shall fall with sword in hand, behind the banner of my king, and it may well end just as I have always wished." King Haakon commanded only 9 ships, while the sons of Eric had 20. Still, he sent word to them, proposing that they meet not on the sea, but upon a broad field nearby, fair ground for open combat. The offer was accepted, and Eric's sons marched their army inland. Before the battle, Egil asked Haakon for 10 men, each bearing a banner. The king granted him his request, and Egil led those men to a ridge overlooking the battlefield, spacing them apart so that from below it would appear as though a vast force was preparing to descend upon the enemy's rear. Meanwhile, Haakon arrayed his own warriors across the plain in a long line to prevent encirclement. When the armies met, the clash was fierce, steel rang, and blood was shed. As Egil's banners came into view over the ridge, the troops of Eric's sons mistook them for the vanguard of a new and unseen army. A great shout rose among them that they were about to be caught between 2 hosts. The fear turned swiftly to flight. Even the sons of Eric, seeing their men break, turned and fled. Haakon pressed hard in pursuit, cutting down the retreating foe, chasing them over hills and fields. Few escaped, yet the battle was not over. Gamle Eriksson, one of Haakon's nephews, had fled the field, but once more gathered his men upon the southern plain. There, reinforced by his brothers and what troops remain, he stood ready to renew the fight. At the front charged Egil Ulserk, fearless and grim. He met Gamle in single combat, but Egil fell, the old warrior meeting death as he had wished, in battle and glory. Then Haakon arrived with fresh men, and once again battle ensued. Like a tempest he drove through the ranks, cutting down man after man. At last, the sons of Eric saw their cause was lost. They turned again to their ships, but in the chaos, many vessels had been pushed adrift. Some still lay grounded, and in desperation, the sons of Eric plunged into the sea. Gamle Eriksson drowned in the attempt. His brothers would reach the remaining ships, gathered what survivors they could, and fled south to Denmark, defeated and embittered. Years passed. Haakon ruled wisely and well, but his enemies were not vanquished. In the 26th year of his reign, while the king was feasting in Hordaland with his court and many of the local bonds, watchmen came running with urgent news. Ships were approaching from the south. It was the sons of Eric once again. After Gamle's death, leadership had passed to Harald, later known as Harald Greycloak. Now he had come with a great Danish army. It was said that the army of the sons of Bloodaxe outnumbered Haakon's army 6-1. So numerous was their force that the land trembled beneath their tread. King Haakon rallied his men, and he stood before them. It is said that he cast off his armour before the battle began, trusting not in steel but in courage. The armies met in a storm of fury. Spears flew, blades clashed, and the snow was stained red with the blood of the fallen. This song was composed of Haakon's bravery. The body coats of naked steel, the woven iron coats of mail, like water fly before the swing of Haakon's sword, the champion king. King Haakon pressed forward with such might and fury that no man could stand before him. Like a storm, he swept through the ranks, and the warriors of Eric's sons wavered, then broke. Panic seized their host, and the army began to flee in all directions. Haakon, ever at the forefront of his men, gave chase without pause, cutting down the fleeing with powerful blows. But in the chaos of battle, as he drove deep into the heart of the retreating foe, a single arrow flew swift and silent through the air, and struck the king beneath the shoulder, lodging deep into the muscles of his arm. When King Haakon returned to his ship, his wound was swiftly bound, yet the blood flowed steadily from the deep gash, and no effort could stop the bleeding. As the sun sank towards the horizon and gave way to dusk, the strength drained from his limbs. Weakened and pale, the king summoned his closest companions to his side and spoke to them with calm resolve about the fate of the kingdom he so loved. Having no sons, only a daughter, Haakon entrusted the realm not to his own blood, but to the sons of Eric, his former foes. He bid his men to send word to them that they should rule Norway in his stead. Yet he asked only this in return, that they honour his loyal friends and treat them with dignity. And if by the will of God, he said, should allow me to live, I shall leave this land and journey to a Christian kingdom, where I will atone for all the wrongs I have done before the Lord. But if death takes me here in heathen land, then lay me to rest as you see fit. Shortly thereafter, King Haakon the Good breathed his last. Grief swept through the land like a shadow. Friend and foe alike mourned his passing, for such a king had never been seen before in Norway, and perhaps never would be again. His body was laid in a great burial mound, clad in his finest garments and full armour, as was the customs of old. Though he had embraced the Christian faith, Haakon never sought to destroy the old ways. He had spared the temples of Odin, and respected the beliefs of his people, and so in death they honoured him as they had their forebears. At his grave they spoke the ancient words, and wished him safe passage to Valhalla, the hall of the brave. A skald composed a poem in his honour, to carry his name across the ages, and to guide his soul into the halls of the gods. In Odin's hall an empty place stands for a king of Yngvi's race. Go my Valkyries, Odin said, go forth my angels of the dead. Gondul and Skogul to the plain, drenched with the battle's bloody rain, and to the dying Haakon tell, here in Valhalla shall he dwell. In the shadow of a murdered king, a child was born upon a lonely island, an exile before he could walk, a fugitive before he could speak. That child was Olaf Tryggvason. His life would be no gentle ascent to power, but a saga forged in fire and storm. Sold into slavery as a boy, torn from his mother's arms, and carried across the Baltic world, Olaf learned early that fate is not granted, it is seized. He would rise from chains to command longships, from obscurity to kingship, carving his name into the harsh frontiers of the Viking Age. When at last he claimed the throne of Norway, he did not rule as a passive heir, but as a force of upheaval. With sword in one hand and the cross in the other, Olaf sought to break the old gods and baptize a kingdom. Temples burned, chieftains bent the knee or broke beneath his will. To some, he was a tyrant who ruled by fear and flame. To others, he was the chosen instrument of destiny, the king who wrenched Norway from pagan twilight into the light of Christendom. The life of Olaf Tryggvason is not merely a story of a king, it is the story of transformation itself, of a man who rose from the lowest depths to reshape a nation, and whose legend still echoes across the cold northern seas. This is a tale of pain, suffering, and a man forged by endless tragedy. Did his life make him a villain? That's up to you to decide. This is his story according to the saga of Norse kings. Our story begins with the death of King Tryggve Olafsson, king of the Viking, who was murdered by the High King of Norway, Harald Greycloak, in the year 963. His pregnant widow Astrid fled in secret, taking what wealth she could. Her faithful foster father Thorolf remained steadfast beside her, while her loyal friends kept watch for lurking enemies. Heavy with child, Astrid sought refuge upon a small island in a lonely lake. There, she bore a son, who was sprinkled with water and named Olaf after his grandfather. She stayed hidden through the summer, but as darkness lengthened and winter drew near, she was forced to return to the mainland. Travelling only by night and speaking to no one, she at last reached her father's home. Harald Greycloak and his brother Gudrod rode to the estate once held by the slain Tryggve Olafsson, but Astrid had vanished, and no trace of her could be found. Soon a rumour reached them. She was with child. Harald Greycloak and King Tryggve were both the blood of Harald Fairhair, the first king of Norway. A member of the House of Fairhair could claim the throne, but what mattered was the strength to seize it, and the will of the people to uphold it. Tryggve had been dangerous simply by existing, and so he was murdered. Now if Astrid bore a son, that child too would stand as a rival, and Greycloak would not suffer rivals to live. Astrid had a brother named Sigurd, who had long served with honour in Russia under King Vladimir. Desiring refuge with him, she resolved to make the journey. She set sail with a young Olaf, who was then 3 years old. But as they crossed the Baltic, Estonian Vikings fell upon their ship. The company was plundered, some were slain, others carried off as slaves. Olaf was torn from his mother. An Estonian named Clercon took the boy, and Olaf was eventually bought by a man named Raes in exchange for a fine cloak. Raes and his wife treated the child kindly, and he was well loved in their household. Thus, Olaf spent 6 years as a slave in Estonia, far from his mother and his royal birthright. Sigurd, brother to Astrid, came from Novgorod into Estonia on King Vladimir's business, charged with gathering tribute. He travelled in splendour, attended by many followers. In the marketplace, he noticed a striking boy who seemed clearly a foreigner. Asking at once his name and kin, he learned that the child was Olaf, son of Tryggve Olafsson and Astrid. At once Sigurd recognised him as his sister's son. Hearing the boy's tale of captivity, Sigurd went to the peasant Raes and purchased both Olaf and Thorgils. He then brought them with him to Holmgard, though at first he kept Olaf's true lineage secret and treated him with quiet care and honour. One day in the marketplace at Holmgard, Olaf Tryggvason slew Clercon, the man who had slain his foster father and then sold him into slavery. With a small axe in one hand, Olaf buried an axe in his head and fled to Sigurd, confessing what he had done. Sigurd brought the boy at once to Queen Alogia, begging her protection. Though the law of the city demanded death for any killing not judged by the court, the queen, moved by Olaf's bearing, shielded him and set armed men about her house. The people clamoured for justice, but the king forbade bloodshed. Peace was made, a fine was set for the death, and the queen paid it. After this, Olaf remained under royal protection. As no prince might dwell there without the king's consent, Sigurd revealed his noble birth and exile. At the queen's urging, the king received him into his court, and raised him as befitted a king's son. Olaf was 9 when he came to Russia, and he stayed 9 years with King Vladimir. Once fully grown, Olaf was said to be the handsomest of men, very stout and strong, and in all bodily exercises he excelled every Northman that was ever heard of. The High King of Norway, Harald Greycloak, had made many enemies in his relentless drive to crush petty kings and powerful jarls, seeking sole dominion over the realm. Foremost among those he had wronged was Haakon Sigurdsson, also known as Haakon the Powerful, the Jarl of Lade. While Olaf lingered in exile in Russia, Haakon rose against the house of Harald Fairhair. To strengthen his cause, he forged an alliance with Harald Bluetooth, the King of Denmark. With Danish support, Haakon enticed Greycloak into Denmark, where he was treacherously slain. Thus, Haakon seized control of Norway as Harald Bluetooth's Jarl, a king in all but name. The man responsible for Olaf's father's death was gone, yet Norway now lay in the hands of one who bore no blood of fair hair. During these tumultuous times in Norway, Olaf was in Russia. King Vladimir made him chief over the men-at-arms who he sent out to defend the land. Olaf won renown in many battles, and proved a fortunate and fearless commander. With the pay he received from the king, he maintained a strong company of warriors at his own expense, rewarding them generously and earning their fierce loyalty. Yet favour breeds envy. As a foreigner raised high in honour by both king and queen, Olaf stirred resentment among the native lords. They warned the king that such a gifted and popular man might one day become dangerous, whispering doubts and sowing suspicion, especially of his frequent counsel with the queen. In time, the king grew distant. Sensing the change, Olaf confided in the queen and declared his wish to seek his fortune in the north, where his forefathers had once ruled. She wished him well, saying his courage would win him honour wherever he went. So Olaf made ready, boarded his ship, and sailed out upon the Baltic Sea. Olaf sailed south along Wendland until he found safe harbour. There, he and his men behaved peaceably and lingered for a time. Wendland was then ruled by King Burisleif, whose daughter Gera governed the region where Olaf had landed. Hearing of those noble yet orderly strangers, Queen Gera, through her counsellor, invited them to winter under her protection, as the season was fast spent and the weather harsh. Olaf accepted, and in the autumn of the year 982, came to her court. They soon grew deeply fond of one another. That winter, Olaf married Queen Gera and ruled beside her over her lands. Olaf would have been around 19 years old. Olaf dwelt 3 years in Wendland before sorrow struck his household. Queen Gera fell grievously ill. Despite all hope, she died of her sickness. Her loss weighed so heavily upon Olaf that Wendland held no joy for him thereafter. Grief stirred at his restless spirit. He gathered warships, armed his men and returned to the sea road. First, he harried Friesland, then Saxland, and from there pressed on as far as Flanders, winning wealth and renown by the sword. One skald sang this of Olaf's adventures: Olaf's broadaxe of shining steel, for the shy wolf left many a meal. The ill-shaped Saxon corpses lay, heaped up, the witch wife's horses prey. She rides by night at pools of blood, where Friesland men in daylight stood. Her horses slake their thirst and fly onto the field where Flemings lie. The raven friend in Odin's dress, Olaf, who foes can well repress, left Flemish flesh for many a meal, with his broadaxe of shining steel. Thereafter Olaf Tryggvason sailed to England and ravaged widely along its coasts. He pressed north to Northumberland, then turned upon Scotland, harrying its shores. From there he made war with the Hebrides, then sailed to the Isle of Man, where he fought again. Ireland felt his fury, and then Bretland, which he laid waste with fire and sword, together with the land of Cumberland. At last, intending to return to England, he came to the Scilly Isles, far out in the Western Sea. 4 years had passed in ceaseless warfare since he left Wendland and took once more to the life of a sea king. This song was composed in his honour. The brave young king who never retreats, the Englishmen in England beats. Death through Northumberland is spread, from battle-axe and broad spearhead. Through Scotland with his spears he rides, to man his glancing ships he guides. Feeding the wolves where'er they came, the young king drove a bloody game. The gallant bowmen in the isles slew foemen who lay heaped in piles. The Irish fled at Olaf's name, fled from a young king seeking fame. In Bretland and in Cumberland, people against him could not stand. Thick on the fields their corpses lay, the ravens and howling wolves a prey. While Olaf was in the Scilly Isles, he heard of a hermit said to foresee events yet to come. Curious to test him, Olaf first sent a splendidly dressed warrior to pose as a king. The seer answered calmly, "Thou art not the king, but be faithful to him," and he said no more. Intrigued, Olaf went himself and asked what fate awaited him. The hermit replied, "Thou shalt be a renowned king, and perform great deeds. Many shall come to faith and baptism through thee, and as proof, when thou returnest to thy ships, treachery shall rise against thee. A battle will follow, many of thy men shall fall, and thou shalt be sorely wounded, and borne on a shield to thy ship. Yet within 7 days thou shalt be healed, and then thou shalt receive baptism." All came to pass as foretold. A mutiny broke out. Olaf was badly wounded and carried to his vessel, but within a week he was restored. Convinced of the hermit's divine gift, Olaf returned and learned that it was the Christian God who revealed such mysteries. Moved by these words and the signs he had seen, Olaf received baptism, and with him his followers. He remained there for a time, embracing the faith and taking priests and learned men into his company. They would all abandon the old ways and their ancestral gods. In the autumn of the year 988, Olaf sailed from the Scilly Isles to England. As both he and the land were now Christian, he came in peace. At that time, a great thing was summoned, where all men were to assemble. Among those present was Queen Gyda, the sister of Olaf Curan, the King of Dublin. Widowed from a powerful English earl, she now ruled his lands. Many sought her hand, especially a famed warrior named Elfvine, but she declared she would choose her husband herself. The thing was called so that she might make her choice. Elfvine came richly dressed, as did many others. Olaf stood apart in rough seafarer's clothes. As Gyda passed among the men, her gaze fell upon him. She asked who he was. Learning of her noble birth and station, Olaf spoke further with her, and they soon came to an agreement. Thus, Olaf and Gyda were betrothed. Elfvine was bitterly angered by Gyda's choice. In those days, it was custom in England to settle such disputes by single combat, and he challenged Olaf. It was agreed that each man should come with 12 men. When they met, Olaf instructed his followers to act as he did. Armed with a great axe, he struck first, hewing Elfvine's sword from his hand, and with his second blow felled him to the ground. Elfvine was then bound, and the same fate befell his men. All were defeated, tied up, and carried away. It must be noted that Olaf was no mere Viking warrior. He was exceptional. He was famously able to fight and cut equally well with both hands, and could cast 2 spears simultaneously with both of his arms. His acrobatic skills were legendary, as he could reportedly walk on the oars outside his ship while his men were rowing. He was known for juggling 3 daggers or swords, always keeping one in the air. These are just some of the descriptions of his abilities. Olaf spared Elfvine's life, but banished him from the country and took his possessions. Thus he won Gyda as his wife, and thereafter lived between England and Ireland. Olaf Tryggvason would not remain idle long. Restless as the northern sea that bore him, he turned his prows to Essex and made war upon the Saxons. For though he had bent the knee to Christ, the old inheritance of his blood, the fierce calling to go Viking still burned within him. That clash of worlds and wills would be immortalised in the Old English poem, known as the Battle of Maldon, where courage and catastrophe stand side by side in solemn verse. At the time, England's royal policy toward Viking incursions was bitterly divided. Some counselled tribute, land, gold and silver, to purchase a fragile peace. Others urged that the invader be met in open battle. The poem makes clear that Berthnoth, the ealdorman of Essex and leader of the Saxon host, held firmly to the latter course. His speeches ring with patriotism, calling his men to steadfastness rather than submission. The Viking fleet rowed up the river Blackwater, then called the Panther, and Berthnoth summoned out the fjord. The poem opens with the Lord commanding his men to stand fast and grasp their weapons. Across the water, Olaf addressed the English, offering to depart in peace if tribute were paid in gold and armour. Berthnoth's answer was iron-bound. "We will pay you with spear tips and sword blades." When the tide ebbed, Olaf's warriors pressed across the narrow bridge. 3 Englishmen, Wulfstan, Ilfhir and Maccus, held the crossing stoutly, felling any who dared advance. Yet the Viking commander called for open ground and formal battle, and Berthnoth, in a gesture at once noble, allowed the enemy to come ashore. But in the hour of true battle, treachery took root. An Englishman named Godric fled the field, upon Berthnoth's own horse. His brothers followed. Seeing the Lord's steed in flight, many supposed their leader had abandoned them, and panic spread. The Vikings, though bloodied, broke the Saxon ranks and slew Berthnoth where he stood. After the carnage, his body was found without a head, yet his gold-hilted sword still lay beside him, a sign he had died a warrior's death. Berthnoth was immortalised as a hero of unbending loyalty, but for England, the defeat was grievous. King Ethelred the Unready, the King of England, would soon confront Olaf. He heeded the counsel of the Archbishop of Canterbury and chose to buy peace. 10,000 pounds of Roman silver, a vast ransom, amounting to some 3,300 kilograms today, were paid to the Viking fleet. In return, the Northmen agreed to cease their raiding, and in word at least, to aid England against other Viking threats. However, Olaf did not keep his word. Restless for conquest, he bound himself to the formidable Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard, and together they gathered a vast armada, 94 ships, their prows carved like dragons, their sails darkening the horizon. Their aim was nothing less than the plunder of London, then the greatest and wealthiest trading centre in England. In the year 994, the fleet swept up the River Thames and fell upon the city in fury. Iron rang against the ancient Roman walls as the Vikings strove to break through and cast London into flame. Yet the citizens and their military answered with unexpected resolve. From ramparts and riverside, they fought with desperate courage, while the city's stout fortifications, and perhaps a newly raised wooden bridge spanning the Thames, barred the longships from passing further upstream. The assault faltered. The coalition of Olaf and Sweyn suffered heavy losses, and the walls of London stood unbreached. It was a rare and stinging defeat for such a mighty host. But though repelled, the Northmen did not depart England's shores. Turning from ships to horse, they rode out across Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Hampshire, laying waste to field and village. Smoke rose over the countryside as burning plunder and slaughter marked their passage. Against such a swift and shifting foe, King Ethelred the Unready found no decisive answer in open battle. Guided by his counsellors, the Witan, he chose once more to pay them tribute. 16,000 pounds of silver were promised to the invaders, a staggering ransom, and the Vikings were granted winter quarters at Southampton, where provisions were supplied by the very people they had ravaged. This campaign would prove the last time Olaf made war upon England. Having taken his silver and stood as sponsor at his Christian confirmation under Ethelred's patronage, he turned his sails from English waters and made his way to Dublin, where his father-in-law ruled. In the meantime, Haakon Sigurdsson, the ruler of Norway, began to hear troubling whispers. Sailors spoke of a man far to the west, beyond the North Sea, called Olaf, a man whom many already regarded as a king. From these rumours, the Earl grew suspicious. He knew that Tryggve Olafsson had once had a son named Olaf Tryggvason, a child who, after his father's death, had been taken east to Russia and raised at the court of King Vladimir. Though this Olaf was said to have come from Russia, that detail only deepened Haakon's concern. The more he inquired, the more he feared that this western adventurer might indeed be the same Olaf, a true heir of Norway's royal line. Determined to learn the truth, the Earl trusted in his friend, Thor Clacker, a seasoned traveller who had long sailed as both Viking and merchant, and who knew the western lands well. Haakon sent Thor across the North Sea under the guise of a trading voyage to Dublin, as many Norsemen often did. His mission, however, was secret. He was to discover who this Olaf truly was. If he found certain proof that the man was Olaf Tryggvason, or any other prince of Norway's royal blood, then Thor was to win his confidence by cunning and deceit, and if possible, draw him into the Earl's power. Thor sailed west to Ireland, and soon learned that Olaf was in Dublin, staying with his wife's father, the King of Dublin. Being a smooth and persuasive man, Thor quickly made Olaf Tryggvason's acquaintance. They met often and spoke at length, and in time Olaf began to question him closely about Norway, especially about the kings of the uplands and the great chiefs of the land who yet lived, and what power they held. He asked too about Haakon the Powerful, and whether he was liked well among the people. Thor answered carefully. The earl, he said, was so mighty that no man dared speak against him. Yet this obedience sprang more from fear than love, for there was no other leader to look to. Still, he added, many brave men, even whole districts, would far rather see a king descended from Harald Fairhair rule over Norway. But no such prince is known to us, and all attempts against Earl Haakon have so far proved in vain. Earl Haakon had defeated a great host of combined armies. King Harald Bluetooth brought all the strength of Denmark and the Joms Vikings to Norway, and Haakon, with the aid of the old gods, defeated them. He was indeed a great man. As their conversations continued, Olaf at last revealed his true name and lineage. He was none other than Olaf Tryggvason, heir of Norway's ancient kings. He asked Thor frankly whether the great men of Norway would accept him as king if he came to claim his birthright. Thor warmly encouraged the venture, praising Olaf's courage and abilities, and urging him to seize the inheritance of his forefathers. Olaf's resolve strengthened, and he determined to sail for Norway. Thor, it seemed, had switched sides, and betrayed his friend Haakon. With 5 ships and Thor at his side, Olaf set forth, first to the Hebrides, then onward to the Orkneys. There they found Earl Sigurd, the Earl of Orkney. After only a few words, Olaf demanded that Sigurd accept baptism, and that all his people do the same, or face immediate death. He declared that he would lay waste to the islands with fire and sword if Christianity were refused. This was but an omen of what would happen to a fiercely pagan Norway under Olaf's rule. Earl Haakon Sigurdsson was feasting in his hall when word reached him of a man named Orm, whose wife Gudrun was renowned as the fairest woman in all Norway. Haakon, long infamous for his womanizing ways, was said to crave the company of women beyond measure, often summoning the daughters and wives of noblemen to his side, only to dismiss them again after a few short weeks. Inflamed by desire, he sent thralls to Orm with a command that Gudrun be brought to him at once. Orm refused, summoning his neighbours. He would not see his household dishonoured. Outrage swept the countryside. How could their ruler so brazenly shame his own subject, demanding a man's wife as though she were tribute? The men of Norway rose in fury and marched upon the Earl's hall. Haakon fled with only a handful of men. The rebels believed he had escaped to his ships under command of his son Erland, and blocked the roads to cut off his flight. When night fell, the Earl dismissed his followers and slipped away with only his trusted thrall Kark, thinking 2 men might pass unnoticed where a company would not. They hid first in a cave, where Kark dreamed troubled visions foretelling his master's doom. In growing desperation, Haakon sought refuge at a lonely farm. There, beneath the floor of a swine sty, Kark dug a pit in which they might conceal themselves. And while the fallen Earl lay hidden in filth, word came like a gathering storm. Olaf Tryggvason had entered Norway. Haakon and Kark hid in the pit, which was covered with wood, earth and dung, driving swine over it to conceal the spot. There, beneath filth and stone, the fallen ruler of Norway lay in darkness, while his enemies closed in. Olaf Tryggvason soon learned that the men of Norway had risen against Haakon Sigurdsson, driving him into flight and scattering his followers. The great chiefs and warriors of the realm gathered to Olaf and pledged their loyalty. Thus the line of Harald Fairhair was restored, and Olaf was hailed as king. His first command was clear: the Earl must be found. Search parties scoured the countryside until word came that Thor, one of Haakon's closest friends, owned a farm where he might be hiding. The king's men searched the house from roof to hearth, yet found no trace of him. Then Olaf called a meeting in the yard. Standing upon a great stone beside the swine sty, he addressed the people and promised rich rewards and high honour to the man who would slay the Earl. Beneath that very stone, hidden in a pit below the sty floor, Haakon and his thrall Kark heard every word. All night they lay awake, each wary of the other. Toward dawn, the Earl at last fell into a troubled sleep. His rest was so violent that he drew up his limbs, lifted his head as if to rise, and uttered a dreadful cry. Kark, seized with terror, and perhaps tempted by the king's promise, drew a knife from his belt. He thrust it into the Earl's throat and cut across, killing him there in the darkness. Kark then severed Haakon's head. He laid the grisly trophy before King Olaf, recounting all that had passed. But Olaf would not reward such treachery. The thrall was led away at once and beheaded, and thus ended the life of Earl Haakon, not in battle, but in fear and betrayal, beneath a swine sty floor. Earl Eric, the son of Earl Haakon, his brother Svein, and their brothers and relations fled out of the country, and went east to Sweden, to King Olaf the Swede, who gave them a good reception. Now that Olaf Tryggvason had taken the throne of Norway, he declared without hesitation that Christianity should be proclaimed throughout his realm. He vowed that he would either see all Norway made Christian, or die in the attempt. At once the king made his will known. He urged the people to accept the new faith, and among those who had already pledged him loyalty, the most powerful men in the assemblies, his message was received with approval. Seeing the chiefs submit to baptism, many others followed, and thus the people of the Viking entered into the Christian faith. Olaf then journeyed north through the Viking, summoning each district to accept Christianity. When persuasion failed, he ruled with stern resolve. Some who resisted were slain, others maimed, and some were even driven into exile. By force of will as much by preaching, he pressed forward until all the lands once ruled by his father King Tryggve were brought under the cross. And so, by the year 997, all the region of the Vikings stood as a Christian land, shaped by the iron determination of its new king. He travelled from district to district, through the Viking, the western fjords, northward toward Trondelag and Halogaland, summoning assemblies, breaking pagan idols, and building churches where temples had stood. Chiefs were given a stark choice: baptism or ruin. Some bent the knee willingly, stirred by conviction or loyalty. Others yielded before the king's threats of death, mutilation, or exile. The ancient worship of Odin and Thor gave way, often painfully, to Christ. Thus, in a few fierce years, Olaf sought to do what generations had not, to forge one kingdom under God, sealing Norway's fate. Early in the spring of the year 998, Olaf Tryggvason sought the hand of Queen Sigrid the Haughty, the widow of Eric the Victorious, the King of Sweden. The match promised strength and alliance between kingdoms, and Olaf desired it greatly. Yet he demanded one condition above all others: that Sigrid accept baptism and renounce the faith of her ancestors. The queen answered him with calm resolve, "I will not abandon the belief I have held, nor that which my forebears held before me. Yet I do not forbid you to worship the God who pleases you best." At this Olaf's temper flared. In anger he cried, "Why should I wed thee, an aging heathen woman?" And in a rash and fateful gesture, he struck her across the face with his glove. Then he rose, ending the meeting in bitterness. Sigrid, unshaken, looked upon him and said quietly, "This may one day be thy death," and her words lingered like a dark omen over the years to come. Soon after, Olaf called an assembly and proclaimed before the gathered people that any man proven to consort with evil spirits, practice witchcraft, or deal in sorcery would be driven from the land. He declared that Norway would no longer harbour those who clung to dark and forbidden arts. By the king's command, the countryside was searched, and all who were suspected of such practices were seized and brought before the Thing. Yet Olaf did not immediately pronounce sentence. Instead, he ordered that they be gathered into a large and finely adorned hall. There, a great feast was prepared, and strong drink was served to them in abundance. When the men were deep in their cups and overcome with drunkenness, the king gave a terrible order. The hall was set ablaze, and the flames rose swiftly around it. None escaped. Thus in fire and smoke, Olaf sought to purge his kingdom of sorcery, and make fear serve where faith would not. It is told that once, while Olaf Tryggvason was holding a feast, there came to him one evening a strange old man, richly gifted in speech, and wearing a broad-brimmed hat low upon his brow. He was one-eyed, and seemed to possess knowledge of every land beneath the sun. The king welcomed him, and the two fell into a long conversation. Olaf, delighted by the stranger's wisdom, questioned him on many matters, and to each inquiry the old man gave ready and thoughtful answers. Thus they spoke deep into the night, the king ever eager for more tales of ancient days. At last the bishop reminded Olaf that it was time to seek his rest, and the king withdrew to his bed. Yet even the old man seated himself upon the footstool and continued his storytelling, one tale flowing into another without end. Again, the bishop urged the king to sleep, and at length Olaf closed his eyes. The stranger quietly departed. Before long the king awoke and called for his guest, but he was nowhere to be found. The next morning Olaf summoned his cook and cellarmaster, and asked whether any unfamiliar men had come among them. They answered that while preparing the meal, a stranger had entered and rebuked them for setting poor fare before the king. He had given them 2 large and choice cuts of beef, which they had added to the pot. At this the king ordered that all the meat be cast away at once. "This man," he said, "can be none other than Odin, whom the heathens have so long worshipped. But Odin shall not deceive us." And so the king made certain that neither by word nor by food would the old gods find a place at his table. Olaf would march with all his strength into Trondelag, where the fiercest resistance to Christianity remained. The chiefs and great warriors gathered in arms, determined to defend the old gods. At the Thing, the king called upon them to accept the new faith. Their spokesman, Jarnskeg, answered boldly that they would keep their ancient laws. Olaf replied that he would enter their temple and see the rites for himself. The men agreed, and together they went inside. There stood the image of Thor, adorned with gold and silver. The king raised his axe and struck it down, casting the god from his seat. His men followed, toppling the other idols. Outside, Jarnskeg was slain, and when Olaf emerged, he offered the people a choice: baptism or battle. Leaderless and shaken, they chose submission. The king had them baptized and took hostages to secure their loyalty, and soon all of Trondelag accepted Christianity. Afterward, Olaf went to Nidaros and founded a trading town upon the banks of the river Nid, building his royal hall there and establishing it as a new seat of power. To settle the blood feud for Jarnskeg's death, Olaf met with his kinsmen and offered compensation. In the end, it was agreed that he should wed Jarnskeg's daughter Gudrun. Yet on their wedding night, believing the king asleep, Gudrun drew a knife to kill him. Olaf saw the blade in time, seized it, and left her chamber. Gudrun departed with her followers at once, and never again shared the king's bed. Olaf would command the building of a mighty vessel, greater than any yet seen in Norway. It was fashioned with 34 pairs of oars, manned by 68 rowers, and its sides rose high and proud, as lofty as those of a great sea-going merchant ship. She was built in the form of a dragon, and the king named her the Long Serpent. Her prow and stern arched upward in splendid curves, both richly gilded, and her bulwarks towered above the waves, fit to brave the wildest seas. No ship more magnificent or more costly had ever been seen in Norway. The Long Serpent stood as a floating symbol of Olaf's power, fierce and unmatched upon the northern waters. One dark night, Queen Tura fled her husband Burislav of Wendland and made her way to Denmark, yet she dared not remain there, fearing that her brother Sweyn Forkbeard would force her back to Wendland. Secretly, she journeyed on to Norway, where she came before Olaf. Olaf received her kindly. She spoke of her sorrows and sought his protection, and the king, struck by her grace and eloquence, soon asked for her hand. Seeing little other refuge, and counting it as fortune to wed a renowned ruler, Tura consented. They were married in autumn, and passed the winter together at Nidaros. When spring came, Tura often wept, lamenting that rich lands and treasures she possessed in Wendland were lost to her. With gentle words, she urged Olaf to reclaim her property, saying that King Burislav would not deny him. His counsellors warned against such a venture, but Tura persisted. One day, Olaf brought her many gifts, but she cast them aside, saying her father Harald Bluetooth had given richer gifts to her mother, and had not feared to sail forth and claim what was his. She rebuked Olaf, accusing him of lacking the courage to face Denmark and her brother King Sweyn Forkbeard. At this the king leapt up in anger. Swearing loudly, he declared that he never feared King Sweyn, and that if they should meet, it would be Sweyn who would yield. Sweyn Forkbeard was married, as has been told, to Sigrid the Haughty, and Sigrid bore a deep and burning hatred toward Olaf. The cause lay in their former meeting, when Olaf had broken off his suit and struck her across the face. The insult had never faded from her memory. Again and again, she urged King Sweyn to make war upon Olaf. She reminded him that Olaf had taken his sister Tura in marriage without his consent, an affront, she said, that no former king would have endured. With such words, she stirred his pride and sharpened his resolve, until at last Sweyn determined upon battle. Early in the spring, the Danish king sent messengers to the Swedish king and Earl Eric, son of Norway's former ruler, Haakon Sigurdsson. Sweyn warned them that Olaf of Norway was gathering men for a summer expedition to Wendland, and proposed that they unite their forces and strike him together. The Swedish king and Earl Eric needed little persuasion. Each had his own cause against Olaf, and both were eager for the venture. They swiftly assembled a great fleet and sailed to join King Sweyn. When the three powers met, their combined armada formed an immense and formidable host upon the sea. While Sweyn sent word to Sweden to muster an army, he also dispatched Earl Sigvalde, chief of the Joms Vikings, a feared mercenary order, to Wendland, charging him to spy upon Olaf, and, by craft and subtle counsel, bring about a meeting between Olaf and the allied kings. Sigvalde first sailed to Jomsborg, the Joms Viking headquarters, and from there sought out King Olaf. He spoke with warmth and courtesy, and soon won the king's confidence. His wife Astrid, daughter of King Burislav, was well disposed toward Olaf, for Olaf had once been married to her sister Gira. Thus, Sigvalde found ready favour at court. A shrewd and quick-witted man, the Earl gradually gained influence in Olaf's councils. Under various pretexts, he urged delay in the king's return to Norway, though Olaf's men were eager to sail and lay waiting only for a fair wind. Their patience wore thin, but Sigvalde continued to contrive excuses. At last, he received word from Denmark. The Swedish king's fleet had arrived from the east. Earl Eric's forces were assembled, and the allied chiefs had resolved to sail toward Wendland and lie in wait at an island called Svold. Sigvalde was instructed to manage matters so that King Olaf would pass that way and fall into their trap. Upon the island lay Sweyn Forkbeard, the king of Denmark, Olaf, the king of Sweden, and Earl Eric, the son of Haakon Sigurdsson, all gathered with their mighty hosts. The day was bright and clear, and the chiefs, attended by a great company, went out upon the isle to watch the ships moving across the sunlit sea. Among the vessels they beheld one tall and shining. "That is a noble ship," said the two kings. "Surely it must be the Long Serpent." But Earl Eric answered calmly, "It is not the Long Serpent." Soon another vessel appeared, larger still. King Sweyn said with scorn, "Olaf must be afraid. He dares not sail with the dragon head upon his prow." Eric replied, "That is not the king's ship." Then they saw Earl Sigvalde's ships, which turned in beneath the island. After them came 3 great vessels under sail. One of them was of notable size. "There comes the Long Serpent," cried King Sweyn. He ordered his men aboard. But Earl Eric counselled patience. "Olaf has other stately ships beside that one. Let us wait." Some mocked him, saying he would not avenge his father, and that it would be shameful indeed if such a great force lay idle while Olaf sailed past them into the open sea. When at last the true Long Serpent came fully into view, none could doubt that it was Olaf Tryggvason himself who sailed within her. Then the allied kings armed in earnest. Before this day, they agreed among themselves that should Olaf fall, Norway would be divided into 3 realms. Whoever first boarded the serpent could claim her and all the treasure she bore, and each leader would keep the ships he himself had cleared. Olaf Tryggvason stood upon the quarterdeck of the Long Serpent, towering above all who fought below. A gilded shield shone upon his arm, and a helmet wrought with gold crowned his head. Over his mail he wore a short red tunic, so that he might be plainly seen. When he beheld the enemy fleets drawing together beneath their standards, he asked, "Who commands the host that lies directly before us?" He was told it was Sweyn Forkbeard with the Danish army. Olaf answered, "We have little to fear from those Danes. Courage is not their strength, but who stands to the right of them?" They replied, "It is Olaf with the Swedish force." Better for those Swedes, said Olaf, to sit at home with their sacrifices than to face the weapons of the Long Serpent. And who commands the other great ships? It is Earl Eric Haakonsson, they said. Then the king answered gravely, he has cause enough to seek us out, and from him we may look for the fiercest struggle, for these are Norsemen, as we are ourselves. The kings now laid out their oars, and prepared to attack. King Sweyn laid his ship against the Long Serpent. Outside of him Olaf the Swede laid himself, and set his ship's stern against the outmost ship of King Olaf's line, and on the other side lay Earl Eric. Then a hard combat began. Earl Sigvalde held back with the oars on his ships, and did not join the fray, and betrayed Olaf of Norway. The battle that followed was among the fiercest ever told in song, and the sea ran red with the blood of warriors. The men of Olaf Tryggvason cast grappling hooks and chains upon the ships of Sweyn Forkbeard, drew them close, and smote down all who stood upon their decks. Ship after ship was cleared, until Sweyn himself was driven to flee seeking shelter. Thus it befell exactly as King Olaf had foretold. Then Olaf of Sweden advanced in his stead, and met the same ruin. His ships were shattered, his men cut down, and he too was forced to withdraw. But Eric Haakonsson pressed on with grim resolve. He laid his iron-bound prow beside the outermost of Olaf's ships, slew her defenders, severed her cables, and let her drift empty upon the tide. Any lesser ships were stripped of men, their crews fled. The Danish and Swedish vessels kept their distance, encircling the Long Serpent from afar. Only Earl Eric remained close. At last, all of Olaf's ships were emptied of defenders, save the Long Serpent. Onto her decks gathered every man still able to bear arms. There the struggle grew savage beyond measure. Spears thrust and axes hewed. Swords rang upon mail. Arrows and javelins darkened the air until shields could scarcely receive them. All the while King Olaf stood high upon the gangway, shooting tirelessly, now with bow, now with spear, and often casting 2 spears at once. Looking down at the fray, he said, "Why do you smite so faintly to his men? Why do your blows not bite?" "The swords are blunted and notched," came the answer. Then the king strode to the forehold, opened the chest beneath his high seat, and drew forth keen blades bright and sharp, which he placed into his warrior's hands. Yet as he reached out, blood was seen running beneath his steel glove, though none knew where he had been wounded. Desperate was the defence of the Long Serpent, but the ranks were thinning fast. When Earl Eric saw how few remained by the mast, he resolved to board. With 4 men he leaped upon the Serpent, and a terrible combat raged. Eric was driven back to his own ship. Some of his companions lay dead, others wounded. Yet he returned again and again, until the decks of the Serpent were full of fallen men. Eric's warriors poured in from every corner, while those who could still fight gathered around their king in a final stand. The end came swiftly. Overmatched and surrounded, the brave defenders fell one by one. Then, when Olaf Tryggvason saw all was lost and the end had truly come, he leapt from the Long Serpent into the sea. At once a rumour spread among men that the king had cast off his mail beneath the waves and swum away, diving under the enemy's longships, and so by some wondrous fortune made his escape to Wendland. In the years that followed, many tales were told of King Olaf's hidden wanderings and strange adventures in distant lands. Yet these stories may have been shaped by hope or longing. This is certain: Olaf Tryggvason was never again seen in the kingdom of Norway. A song was sang about his defeat. Does Olaf live, or is he dead? Has he the hungry ravens fed? I scarcely know what I should say, for many tell the tale each way. This I can say, no fear to lie, that he was wounded grievously, so wounded in this bloody strife, he scarce could come away with life. The witness who reports this thing, of Tryggvason our gallant king, once served the king and truth should tell, for Olaf hated lies like hell. If Olaf 'scaped from this sword thing, worse fate I fear befell our king, than people guess, but who can know, for he was hemmed in by the foe. From the far east some news is rife, of king sore wounded saving life. His death too sure leaves me no care, for cobweb rumours in the air. It never was the will of fate, that Olaf from such perilous strait should 'scape with life. This truth may grieve, what people wish they soon believe. In a time when the echoes of the Norse gods still whispered through the mountains and fjords, Norway, once united under the iron will of King Harald Fairhair, had crumbled into a shadow of its former glory. The days when Fairhair had subdued every rival king and ruled the land as one had long since faded into legend. With his death, the fragile unity he forged shattered. The petty kings once humbled beneath his sword rose again, each declaring themselves rulers of their own fragmented realms. Fairhair's descendants, bound by blood, yet torn apart by ambition, waged relentless wars for the throne, plunging the land into chaos. Amid this turmoil, a giant known as Haakon the Powerful, said to be a descendant of the legendary Ivar the Boneless, seized control of the country. Yet even he was but a vassal to the Danish king, signalling the end of Norway's independence. The mighty house of Fairhair became a distant memory, its legacy fractured as its descendants scattered across the land, content to rule over mere scraps of what once was a mighty kingdom. But fate had not forgotten the Fairhair bloodline. From the ashes of a broken Norway, one man would rise to reclaim the legacy of his forefathers. Olaf Haraldsson, the great-great-grandson of Fairhair, would embark on a journey that would carve his name into history, not just as a king, but as a saint. Born a pagan, with his blood-stained axe seeing countless battles, he would be remembered as a saint. This is his story. Olaf Haraldsson was born in the dawn of a new millennium, in the year 995, destined for greatness in a land fractured by ambition and war. His father, King Harald Grensk, a proud yet humble ruler of the Vestfold, carried the blood of Norway's first king, Harald Fairhair. Though Harald Grensk was a descendant of legendary kings, his realm paled in comparison to the unified kingdom his forefather had once ruled. Olaf's mother, Asta Gudbrandsdatter, was a woman of noble spirit, known for her generosity and high-mindedness. Yet, according to the sagas, even her virtues could not hold Harald's wandering heart. Driven by ambition and desire, Harald set his sights on a new bride, Sigrid the Haughty, the wealthy and formidable widow of Sweden's King Eric the Victorious. According to the ancient sagas, Sigrid, a woman as cold and ruthless as the northern winds, spurned Harald's advances with fire and fury, having him and his fellow suitors burned alive in a great hall after a feast meant to celebrate their proposed union. In the aftermath of this tragedy, Asta gave birth to a son, Olaf Haraldsson, who would one day rise far above the station of his forebears. Not long after, She remarried, this time to Sigurd Syr, the petty king of Ringerike. As Olaf matured, he was said to be middle of height, but was a very thick man and strong, being known to some as Olaf the Stout. He had light brown hair and a broad face, which was white with a red hue. He had particularly fine eyes, which were beautiful and piercing, so that one was afraid to look him in the face when he was angry. Olaf was an expert in all bodily exercises, with strong arms and shoulders. He was amazing at spear throwing, swimming, and also was an excellent conversationalist. In addition, he was noted to be a master with the axe, for which he would later become famed for. Olaf, with the blood of Harald Fairhair running through his veins, was not content to work on his stepfather's lands, so when he turned 12 in the year 1007, Olaf went Viking and would join a war expedition. Olaf would learn the way of the oar and was a rower to begin, but his party would soon make their way to Denmark. A ballad was made about a young Olaf during his first Viking expedition. Young was the king when from his home he first began in ships to roam, his ocean steed to ride, to Denmark o'er the tide. Out from the distant north, mighty hast thou come forth. Towards autumn, he sailed eastward to the Swedish dominions, and there harried and burnt all the country, for a young Olaf would have his vengeance, and he had a good cause for hostility against the Swedes, as their queen had killed his father Harald by treachery. Olaf would soon have his first taste of battle. A Swedish warlord named Sot, renowned for his ferocity, dared to challenge Olaf and his men. Though outnumbered, Olaf's warriors had the advantage of larger ships, and a brutal sea battle would unfold. As the enemy vessels drew near, Olaf's men hurled grappling irons, latching onto the closest ships and dragging them in. The clash that followed was savage and swift. Olaf and his warriors stormed the enemy decks, cutting down their foes with ruthless precision. The air was thick with the sounds of steel and the cries of the vanquished. In the chaos of battle, Olaf's strength shone like a beacon. Though still in his early teens, his might was already the stuff of legend, earning him the epithet Olaf the Stout. Overwhelmed and broken, Sot's Vikings fled, leaving behind a sea stained with blood. After many victories in Sweden, Olaf set his sights on Finland, which would result in the Battle of Herdaler. According to the sagas, during this conflict, Olaf and his men were ambushed by the Finns in the woods. Olaf lost many men, but made it back to his boats. He ordered his ships to depart despite a rising storm, attributed to the enemy using witchcraft. Despite these events, Olaf and his crew survived, although it nearly cost a young Olaf his life. In his early teens, Olaf had already carved a path of conquest through Sweden, Finland, and the Baltic coasts, leading countless raids and expeditions, growing in both reputation and wealth, his name becoming a force whispered in fear across the lands. Battle after battle, the young warrior proved his might, enduring trials that would break lesser men. By the time he faced his fifth battle, he had become a seasoned fighter. This fateful clash took place in Friesland. Olaf and his men stormed the shores, but the people of the land were ready, charging down to meet them on horseback. The battle that ensued was fierce, with Olaf at the forefront, wielding his axe like a storm. Sigvat the Scald recounts of Olaf's might. Under King Limer's cliff, this battle is the fifth. The brave sea rowers stand. all on the glistening sand, and down the horsemen ride to the edge of the rippling tide. But Olaf taught the peasant band to know the weight of a Viking's hand. Olaf, driven by ambition and the taste of conquest, soon set his sights on Denmark, where he forged a powerful alliance with the legendary Joms Vikings and their towering leader, Thor the Tall. Together, they embarked on a fearsome campaign of plunder across England, their names soon to be etched in infamy. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recounts in grim detail the devastation wrought by these fierce warriors. The Vikings, relentless and ruthless, swept through Essex, Mercia, Wessex and Kent like a storm, leaving a trail of ashes and despair in their wake. Everywhere they went, Olaf and Thorkel led their bands of hardened fighters, plundering the miserable Saxon people, robbing them of their wealth, and mercilessly cutting down any who dared to resist. The years 1009 to 1011 marked the relentless raids that turned the English countryside into a land of shadows, where smoke rose from charred villages, and the cries of the fallen echoed through the night. The Vikings' most infamous conquest came between the Nativity of St. Mary and St. Michael's Mass, when the Viking horde turned its gaze to the great city of Canterbury in Kent. Olaf would have been around 16 at this time, but was still as cunning as he was brutal. He and Thorkel would discover a treacherous path into the city, guided by the whispers of a Saxon townsman who betrayed his own people for survival. Through this secret passage, they infiltrated Canterbury's defences, seizing the city in a whirlwind of steel and fire. The Archbishop of Canterbury, a symbol of the English spirit, would fall into the hands of the Vikings, becoming a prisoner. The city's treasures were pillaged, its people slaughtered or enslaved, and the once great city was left as a smouldering ruin under Viking rule. As the land burned and the people suffered, Olaf and Thorkel grew immensely rich, their coffers overflowing with the spoils of war. The Danegeld, vast sums of gold and silver, were paid to them by the desperate English in hopes of buying peace, a futile attempt to halt the marauding tide. The riches they extorted only fueled their power, and England, now a land of misery, lay under the iron grip of the Viking conquerors. Yet, in a twist of fate, the very king they had tormented with sword and fire sought to turn these fierce raiders into allies. Through delicate negotiations, Ethelred, the King of England, managed to sway the warlords. Thorkel, enticed by both power and wealth, agreed to ally with the king and took Ethelred's daughter as his wife, binding his fate to the royal house. Olaf, ever hungry for more gold and power, would follow suit, swayed by the promise of great riches and influence. In this unexpected alliance, the once ravaging conquerors found themselves at the king's side, no longer enemies, but uneasy allies, their swords now wielded in the service of the realm they had once torn apart. Thus, the saga of Olaf and Thorkel took a new turn, from terrorizing warlords to powerful lords within the very kingdom they had once sought to destroy. However, the fierce Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard, with a mighty army, would soon seize the kingdom from Ethelred. The Danes had spread their power far and wide across the land, and it had come to such a dire point that Ethelred was forced to flee from his own country, seeking refuge in Normandy. But fate would soon intervene. Sweyn, the conqueror of England, would suddenly die in the dead of night, his body found lifeless in his bed. Englishmen whispered of divine justice, claiming that the ghost of Saint Edmund, the long-dead King of East Anglia, had struck him down, as revenge for his cruel murder by Ivar the Boneless. When word of Sweyn's death reached Ethelred in Normandy, he wasted no time. He returned to England with renewed vigour, rallying all who would fight under his banner to reclaim his stolen kingdom. Warriors from every corner of the land flocked to his call, and among them came Olaf, leading a formidable force of Northmen. Already sworn to the English king, Olaf and Ethelred came to an agreement that Olaf would take Northumbria should Ethelred regain the throne. Thus, together, they set their sights on London, steering their fleet into the Thames, where the Danes held a fortified stronghold. Across the river lay the bustling trading hub known as Southwark, where the Danes had constructed mighty defences. Great ditches surrounded the stronghold, and within its walls of stone, timber and turf, a fierce army awaited. King Ethelred ordered a massive assault, but the Danes, hardened by war and commanded by Prince Canute, the son of Sweyn Forkbeard, fought back with relentless ferocity, repelling every attempt to breach their defences. A broad bridge spanned the river between the castle and Southwark, so wide that 2 wagons could pass side by side. Barricades, towers, and wooden parapets lined the bridge, rising nearly to chest height, while beneath the waters, piles had been driven deep into the riverbed. Here, the Danes stood firm, defending their position with every ounce of strength that they had. Desperate to capture the bridge, King Ethelred gathered his chiefs to devise a plan. It was then that Olaf stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with resolve. He proposed to bring his fleet alongside the bridge, challenging the others to do the same. The Council of Saxons agreed, and with determination burning in their hearts, they prepared their ships and readied their men for the bold assault that would decide the fate of the kingdom. With the fleet and men ready for battle, Olaf and his Norse warriors rowed up the river with a relentless determination. As they neared the bridge, a hailstorm of stones, arrows and spears rained down from above, so fierce that neither helmet nor shield could offer true protection. The ships themselves groaned under the onslaught, and many men would retreat from the merciless barrage. But Olaf, young and undaunted, led the Northmen forward, rowing straight to the base of the bridge. With swift precision, they looped their cables around the piles that held the bridge aloft, then rowed downstream with all of their might. The cables would strain, and the piles began to tremble beneath the weight of the bridge. Slowly but surely, the supports gave way. As the structure faltered, the heavily armoured troops standing on it, along with great heaps of stones and weapons, were thrown into chaos. The bridge collapsed, and many of the warriors were plunged into the cold waters of the River Thames. Those who survived the fall fled in terror, some seeking refuge in the castle, others retreating to Southwark. With the bridge destroyed, Southwark fell swiftly to Olaf's forces. The Norse berserkers would send the occupying Danes running for their lives. This would result in Prince Canute and his men fleeing from the city. The warriors and Londoners surrendered the tower and accepted Ethelred as their king once more. Thus, the tide of war shifted, and Olaf's bold strategy brought victory to the English king, as he once more sat upon the English throne. Olaf and his men would revel in their victory, drinking from horns in the great halls of Ethelred. Amid the revelry, a ballad of Olaf's triumph was composed. London Bridge is broken down, gold is won and bright renown, shields resounding, war horns sounding, Hild is shouting in the din, arrows singing, mailcoats ringing, Odin makes our Olaf win. Olaf and his men were a fearsome band of hardened Norse pagan warriors, their ferocity immortalized in sagas and ballads. Steeped in the ancient traditions of their ancestors, they fought with unmatched skill and relentless thirst for glory. Each swing of their swords carried the weight of generations of warriors before them, and their battle cries echoed the primal power of the Norse gods that they worshipped. Under Olaf's command, these warriors became a force to be reckoned with in England. Allying with King Ethelred, they fought with brutal efficiency, reclaiming fortress after fortress from the dead King Sweyn's occupying forces. Their victories were not just battles won, but statements of Norse and English dominance. Among these triumphs, one stood above the rest: the expulsion of Prince Canute, Sweyn's formidable son, from the shores of England. Canute, a man destined to be a king himself, found even his iron will bent before the might of Olaf and his warriors. Their relentless assaults drove him from the land, securing Ethelred's grip on the throne and solidifying Olaf's reputation as a hero for the Saxon cause. With every victory, Olaf's fame grew. His name was spoken with reverence and fear, both in the halls of kings and the whispers of common folk. Riches flowed into his coffers, spoils from the conquered castles and the grateful hands of Ethelred. Gold, silver and jewels piled high. But for Olaf, the true treasure was the legacy he was forging with every swing of his axe. Yet, despite the wealth and glory he amassed, a longing began to stir within him. Years had passed since he had last set foot on the soil of Norway. From the age of 12, Olaf had gone Viking, destined to be a warrior from the moment he could wield a blade. But Norway, the land of his birth, the realm his ancestors had once ruled, called to him like a distant echo. The blood of kings ran through his veins, a lineage that traced back to the great Harald Fairhair, the first to unite the fragmented kingdoms of Norway under one crown. Now Olaf felt the pull of that legacy, the weight of destiny urging him to reclaim what was rightfully his. Ethelred the Unready of England would die in the year 1016, and with Olaf now free from his oath, and with his promised land of Northumbria fading with the king's death, he would think of nothing but his homeland. He had won battles for another king, taken castles in foreign lands, and grown immensely rich. But it all paled in comparison to the yearning that now burned within him, a yearning to return home. He wouldn't return home, however, as a mere Viking, but as a king. His gaze had turned northward, to the rugged fjords and towering mountains of Norway, the kingdom where his ancestors had carved their names into history. With a heart full of ambition and spirit, unyielding as the Norse winds, Olaf prepared to embark on the greatest journey of his life, to reclaim Norway and fulfill his destiny. Olaf, now in his early 20s, was a battle-hardened warrior and was wealthy beyond measure. He would soon arrive in Normandy to trade his many spoils from his countless victories in England. He was welcomed into the court of Richard II, the Duke of Normandy, who recognized the Norseman's reputation and strength. In the grand city of the Rouen, Olaf found himself captivated by the towering cathedral that dominated the skyline. The imposing structure, with its soaring spires and intricate stonework, was unlike anything Olaf had ever seen. Richard and his men often attended mass there, and Olaf, curious and drawn to the solemnity of the rituals, began to accompany them. As he wandered through the sacred halls of the Rouen, he encountered monasteries filled with devoted monks and nuns, and priests leading their congregations in prayer. Bishops would guide their flocks with wisdom and grace, impressing the young Olaf. It was in these moments, amid the quiet reverence of the cathedral and the deep discussions with the archbishop, that Olaf began to question the old gods of his forefathers. The tales of Odin, Thor, and the Norse pantheon, once the foundation of his beliefs, began to loosen their grip on his soul. In their place, the teachings of Christianity took root, offering a path of redemption and purpose that resonated deeply within him. Convinced that this new faith was the true way forward, not just for himself, but for his homeland, Olaf made a monumental decision. In a solemn and transformative ceremony, Olaf renounced the life he had lived, the gods of his ancestors, the brutal ways of the Viking warrior, and embraced the Christian faith. Before the altar of the great cathedral, under the watchful eye of Robert, the Archbishop of the Rouen, Olaf was baptized, the waters washing away the old and heralding the beginning of a new chapter in his life. Moreover, Olaf was deeply inspired by the legendary tales of Charlemagne, the great emperor who had united vast realms under one banner and spread the Christian faith across his empire. These stories ignited a powerful vision within Olaf, a vision of the strong and unified Norway, where the fractured clans of rival kings would be brought together, not by the sword alone, but by the unifying force of Christianity. He envisioned a kingdom where faith would serve as the foundation of his rule, forging a nation as enduring and mighty as the empires of old. With this vision burning in his heart, Olaf resolved to transform Norway into a powerful Christian realm. For 13 long years, Norway had been ruled by the descendants of Haakon the Powerful, the Earls of Lade, who served as regents under the shadow of Denmark's dominion. The legacy of the Fairhair line, once proud and unbroken, had faded with the death of Olaf Tryggvason, and since then, no king of that ancient lineage had claimed the throne. In their absence, Sweyn Forkbeard, the mighty king of Denmark, had seized control, wielding power over Norway through the puppet lords of Lade. The throne of Norway lay empty, the realm fractured and divided, yearning for a leader of true blood and vision. Across the stormy waters of the North Sea, a new hope emerged. Olaf, battle-hardened and wealthy from years of conquest, a warrior descended from the legendary Fairhair. Olaf's fleet cut through the icy waves, carrying with it a promise of a unified Norway. His goal was nothing less than to bring the petty kings, chiefs and earls under his command, to forge a nation that would stand strong against any foe. Olaf, bold and determined, landed on the shores of Norway. He wasted no time and set about travelling across the land, making his presence known to the chieftains of every district. At that time, Norway was under the rule of Sweyn Haraldsson, the Earl of Lade, a powerful leader backed by loyal kin and allies. They spoke out fiercely against Olaf's claim in every gathering, stirring the people against him. But Olaf, sensing the shifting tides of loyalty, decided to make a swift and strategic move. He hastened to the kingdom of the Vestfold, where his stepfather Sigurd Syr ruled. It was there, among familiar faces, that Olaf sought refuge and support. He arrived at the Vestfold, where Olaf was greeted warmly by his mother Asta and her children by Sigurd. Guthorm the eldest stood with pride. A young Sigurd looked up to Olaf with admiration, and Harald the youngest, later known to history as Harald Hardrada, gazed at his half-brother with awe. unaware that he too would one day carve his name into the annals of history. Sigurd, recognizing the gravity of Olaf's ambition, welcomed him with the splendor befitting of a king. A grand feast was held in Olaf's honor, celebrating not only his triumphs abroad, but also his unwavering resolve to claim Norway's throne. The halls of the Vestfold echoed with songs of victory and glory. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats and the sound of clashing horns. Olaf, surrounded by his family and newfound allies, knew that the time was near for him to make his move. The kingdom of Norway was within his grasp, and the fires of destiny burned brightly in his heart. Olaf embarked on a journey to the ancient lands of the uplands, where fertile fields and dense forests stretched north of Oslo. These rich lands, steeped in history, were ruled by kings descended from noble lines, many of whom shed blood with Olaf, tracing their lineage back to the legendary house of Fairhair. With his stepfather Sigurd by his side, Olaf sought to unite these petty kings under his banner, to reclaim the throne of Norway and cast out the influence of foreign rulers. Sigurd, himself a descendant of Fairhair and the wise king of the Vestfold, joined Olaf in his mission. Together, they travelled to meet with the 5 district kings, rulers who held sway over these prosperous lands. In their council, Sigurd and Olaf spoke with conviction, urging the kings to join them in freeing Norway from Danish and Swedish control. King Sigurd would tell all of the other kings of Olaf's virtues, presenting him as the embodiment of their ideals, a powerful heir of Fairhair, a proven battle commander, and a fearless Viking. One of the kings with a solemn gaze spoke first. "It is true that Harald Fairhair's kingdom has fallen into decay, with none of his race holding dominion over all of Norway." The kings, reflecting on the past, recalled the days when their kinsman Olaf Tryggvason had ruled. Though he was of Fairhair's blood, his reign had been harsh, denying them the freedom to worship their gods as they pleased. Since his death, Norway had lived in an uneasy peace under the shadow of the Danish king, content to avoid conflict. Yet, there was a yearning among them for a king of their own blood, a ruler who could restore the glory of their lineage. One of the kings, his voice filled with longing, declared, "I would rather see my kin on the throne of Norway than bow to a foreign chief. I wish that my family could rise again, but only fate will decide if Olaf is destined to reclaim his kingdom." The night wore on as Olaf and Sigurd engaged in deep conversation with the kings, addressing their concerns, listening to their grievances, and forging bonds of trust. As the moon reached its zenith, one by one, the kings rose from their seats. With solemn words and heavy hearts, they swore their oaths to Olaf, pledging their loyalty and aid in his quest to become the supreme king of Norway. In return, Olaf promised them a reign of friendship and fairness. He vowed to improve the country's laws, to treat all with justice and honour, and to restore the greatness of Norway. The kings, now united in purpose, looked upon Olaf with newfound respect, for they saw in him the promise of a better future, a future where the blood of Fairhair would once again rule over a free and unified Norway. The kings convened a grand thing, a gathering of warriors, nobles and freemen, under the wide skies of Norway. The air crackled with anticipation as King Olaf stood before the assembly, his presence commanding respect. With a voice that echoed like thunder through the valleys, he declared his intentions to all the people. "Olaf, spoke of his right to the throne, the blood of kings that flowed within him, and his unwavering determination to rule as their sovereign. He called upon the kings, the landowners and warriors of Norway to recognize him as their overlord and true king. In return, he pledged to uphold their ancient laws, to honor the traditions that had guided their forefathers, and to protect their land from the grasp of foreign invaders. His words were not merely a plea, but a promise forged in the fires of his many battles. He vowed to be the shield against the encroaching powers of Denmark and Sweden, the sword that would defend their freedom. Olaf's speech was powerful, filled with passion and conviction, and it resonated deeply with those who heard it. The people praised him, with their voices rising in agreement. One by one, the upland kings who had gathered alongside him rose to speak. They too pledged their support for Olaf's claim, each king, with words of wisdom and resolve, urged the people to stand behind the rightful heir of Fairhair's lineage. Thus, in that fateful thing, Olaf was declared king over all of Norway. In the cold, iron-streaked winds of Norway, destiny hung heavy over the land. The mighty Earl of Lade, Svein Haakonsson, the ruler of Norway, soon learned that Olaf had been crowned king. Svein, a man of powerful lineage himself, descended from Haakon the Powerful and the fearsome Ivar the Boneless, and would not relinquish his power without a fight. Inevitably, the two titans of Norway were destined to clash in a battle that would decide the future of the kingdom. According to the sagas, Olaf's forces prepared for war. On board his ship, Olaf commanded 100 men, all clad in gleaming coats of ringmail and crowned with foreign helmets that caught the sunlight like burning stars. The majority of his warriors bore shields as white as winter snow, adorned with the golden cross of Christ. Some among them, however, had painted their crosses in deep hues of blue and red, a vivid symbol of their faith and readiness for battle. Every helmet bore a pale cross at its front, a sacred mark of protection. Before setting out, the king commanded a mass to be read, invoking divine favour for the battle to come. His men then refreshed themselves with meat and drink, their hearts steeling with resolve. With oars slicing through the icy waters, Olaf's fleet surged forward, seeking the Earl. As they reached the harbour where Swein's forces lay in wait, they saw the Earl's men hastily arming themselves, their ships being bound together, banners raised and weapons drawn. The clash was imminent. King Olaf, seeing his enemies preparing for the fight, commanded his men to row harder. His ship cut through the waves with ferocious speed, and with a thunderous crash, it locked alongside the Earl's vessel, and the battle began. The battle saga recounts that King Olaf charged into the fray with a zeal unmatched, catching Earl Swein's forces unprepared as they still lingered in the harbour. Among those who fought was Sigvat the Skald, a poet and warrior, who later immortalised the fierce combat in his verses, known as the Nesjar song. No urging did the Earl require, midst spear and sword the battle's fire. No urging did the brave king need, the ravens in this shield storm to feed. Of limb lopping enough was there, and ghastly wounds of sword and spear. Never, I think, was rougher play than both armies had that day. Though Earl Sweyn commanded more men, King Olaf's crew was a force to be reckoned with. These were no ordinary warriors. They had followed their king through countless wars. Each man wore a cold, unyielding shirt of ringmail, so finely crafted that it turned aside blades and arrows alike. Sigvat's verses spoke of the scene. our lads, broad-shouldered, tall and hale, drew on their cold shirts of ring mail. Soon sword on sword was shrilly ringing, and in the air the spears were singing. Under our helms we hid our hair, for thick flew arrows through the air. Right glad was I, our gallant crew, still clad from head to foot to view. The battle raged fiercely, but it soon became clear that Olaf's forces had the upper hand. The ferocity of their assault overwhelmed Sweyn's men. The battlefield became a scene of carnage, as many of Sweyn's warriors fell, their blood staining the waters. Some, desperate to escape the slaughter, leaped overboard, seeking salvation in the sea. As the tide of battle turned against Saint Haakon, he soon realized his cause was lost. Defeated and broken, the once proud Earl abandoned the battlefield, fleeing into exile in Sweden, with the weight of his defeat heavy upon him. The battle for Norway was over, and Olaf stood victorious, a king, not just by blood, but by the sword. In addition, Sweyn would soon die in Sweden. He fell sick, and it proved fatal. Thus, Olaf's rule in Norway was now uncontested. Once more, King Olaf embarked on a journey to the uplands, a land rich in beauty and wealth, where the ancient Norse gods still reigned in the hearts of the people. The rugged northern lands of Norway had long been a bastion of the old ways, where Odin, Thor and Freya were worshipped. But Olaf, zealous in his Christian faith, saw no room for the old gods in his kingdom. With the fires of fanaticism burning bright in his eyes, he summoned every man in those lands to bow before him and renounce their heathen beliefs. In solemn assembly, Olaf asked the men of the uplands if any among them would dare defy him and cling to the gods of their ancestors. And indeed, some voices rose in defiance, refusing to abandon the deities who had protected their forefathers for generations. But defiance had a price. Olaf, unwavering in his faith, and perhaps maddened by his holy mission, unleashed a wave of brutal punishment upon those who stood against him. Some were mutilated, their hands and feet severed as a grisly reminder of their defiance. Others were blinded, condemned to darkness for refusing to see the light of Olaf's God. Some were hanged, their bodies left as grim warnings to others, and still more were slain by the sword, their blood staining the earth in the name of conversion. It was said that no heathen went unpunished under Olaf's reign, not until they bowed before his God and abandoned the old ways. His sword was the cross, and his justice was relentless. Earl and commoner alike felt the weight of his iron rule. Olaf's campaign of terror spread like wildfire through the uplands, as he moved from village to village, town to town, converting all who dared resist his word. He became known as Olaf the Lawbreaker to the common folk, as he did not abide by the laws of the land, and murdered in the name of his new god. But as news of Olaf's tyrannical rule reached the ears of the upland kings, those who had once sworn loyalty to him, a simmering anger began to grow. These kings had bent the knee to Olaf after helping him defeat Sweyn, but they had not expected the iron-fisted rule that followed. In secret, they gathered for a council, speaking in hushed tones of the devastation Olaf was wreaking upon their lands. They whispered of the mutilations, the killings and the exiles, and to make matters worse, Olaf travelled with a vast army, far exceeding the legal limits for a royal progress, trampling over the law with impunity. They were reminded of Olaf Tryggvason's reign, and the district kings had directly told Olaf Haraldsson of their grievances against Tryggvason for not allowing them to worship their own gods. Thus, Division arose among the kings. Some called for battle to meet Olaf's tyranny with steel. Others sought peace, hoping to reason with the mad king. And yet others, fearful of his wrath, wished to do nothing, to bide their time in silence. It was Gudrod, the king of the valley, who finally broke the stalemate. His voice rang out with defiance and anger. "It seems to me a wonder," he declared, "that we circle around this issue without resolution. Are we so frightened of this man? Here we stand, 5 kings, all of us of high birth, the same as Olaf himself. We gave him the strength to defeat our swain, and with our forces he seized this land. But now, if he dares to threaten us with torture and ill words, then I say for myself, I will no longer live as his slave." The words of Gudrod echoed throughout the hall, igniting the fury of the upland kings. They had once sworn allegiance to Olaf, but now, seeing his madness and lust for power, they turned against him. Their anger was no longer about faith alone, it was about their very survival. Olaf's tyranny had pushed them too far, and now the storm that had been gathering in the shadows was about to break. Thus the upland kings, once Olaf's allies, became his enemies, driven to rebellion by a king who could not tolerate their worship of the old gods, and whose thirst for power knew no bounds. When word reached Olaf of a secret meeting among the upland kings, an alliance of nobles who questioned his rule and clung to the old gods, Olaf knew that the time for subtlety was over. One of his loyal spies had infiltrated the gathering and brought back word of their treacherous plans. The kings planned to rise up against Olaf, but Olaf would show them the true meaning of power. Realizing the gravity of the threat, Olaf wasted no time. With the precision of a seasoned tactician, he devised a plan to strike at the heart of the rebellion. He summoned his followers to gather horses, ensuring his forces could move swiftly across the rugged terrain. Other men were ordered to seize every boat along the lake, denying the rebels any means of escape. But Olaf's preparations went beyond mere logistics. Before the battle, he attended mass as was his custom, seeking divine favour for the bloodshed to come. He understood the power of faith and used it to fortify his own resolve. After the service, he took a brief meal, not a feast, but a warrior's sustenance before turning his full focus on the mission that lay ahead. Under the cloak of darkness, Olaf led his fleet of boats across the lake, a silent armada of 400 warriors, all hand-picked for their loyalty and skill. By the time they reached the fortress where the upland king slept, it was just before dawn. The watchmen, unsuspecting and unprepared, had no time to raise an alarm. Olaf's forces slipped through the defences like shadows, surrounding the courtyard before the first rays of light touched the horizon. Olaf's knowledge of the king's whereabouts was no coincidence. His network of spies had given him the exact location of where the traitors slept. His men soon surrounded the houses where the kings would reside, and with brutal efficiency, they blocked every exit and trapped their enemies. When morning came, the kings awoke not to the light of day, but to the cold steel of Olaf's warriors, standing ready to capture them. The rebellion was crushed before it could even begin. The upland kings, who once held sway over their lands, now found themselves at the mercy of a king who had none to give. One by one, the kings were dragged before Olaf, their dreams of resistance shattered. King Horik, known for his unyielding defiance, faced the harshest fate. Olaf, knowing that such a man could never be trusted, ordered his eyes to be gouged out, leaving him blind and powerless. Gudrod, another one of the rebel leaders, suffered a different but equally cruel punishment. His tongue was cut out, silencing him forever. As for King Ring and 2 others, They were banished from Norway, forced to swear to never return under pain of death. Thus, Olaf put an end to his distant kin and the petty kings of Norway. Olaf's vengeance did not stop with the kings. The nobles and farmers who had conspired with them faced their own grim fates. Some were driven from their lands, exiled like their leaders. Others were mutilated, their bodies marked as symbols of their failure. And for few, Olaf offered peace, but only in terms of total submission to his will and the Christian faith. Through his swift and merciless campaign, Olaf solidified his rule over the uplands and sent a clear message to the rest of Norway. Resistance was futile, his power was absolute, and his mission to convert the land to the Christian faith would not be stopped. The old gods were fading, and in their place, the cross of Olaf rose. King Olaf took possession of the land that these 5 kings had possessed, and Olaf now alone bore the title of king in Norway. He would rule the land as he wished, converting the people as was his will. As Olaf ascended to the throne of Norway, a formidable rival loomed over the horizon, Prince Canute, the same man Olaf had now bested at the Battle of London Bridge. But Canute's fortunes had soared since that defeat. He now reigned as king of both Denmark and England, and his name was spoken with reverence across the North Sea. His battle prowess was legendary, and his dominion vast. To counter Canute's growing power, Olaf forged an alliance with Anund Jacob, the King of Sweden. Their alliance was sealed through Olaf's marriage to Anund's sister Astrid. With their forces combined, the 2 kings saw an opportunity to strike while Canute's attention was focused on his English kingdom. They launched a daring raid on the coasts of Denmark, wreaking havoc on Canute's homeland and setting fire to his ancestral seat. Enraged in the year 1026, Canute retaliated with the full might of his empire. He summoned a colossal navy, amassing to around 600 ships, each more fearsome than the last. His flagship alone was said to stretch 80 meters in length, a behemoth on the waves. Olaf and Anund Jacob, knowing they could not match his fleet head-on, devised a cunning plan. They organized the construction of a massive dam of peat and lumber on the river, intending to use the land itself as a weapon. When the Danish navy sailed in, the dam was released, unleashing a torrent of water that swept through countless Danes and Englishmen, the waters churning with the debris of shattered ships and drowned men. But Canute's main fleet lay beyond the river harbour, untouched by the flood. As the survivors of the initial attack regrouped, the full might of Canute's navy began to bear down on the 2 kings. Realizing that fate had granted them all the victory they could achieve for the moment, Olaf and Anund ordered their ships to retreat. Had they continued the fight, they would have faced utter destruction, for Canute's numbers were overwhelming. Even though Canute had lost many ships, his sheer force of arms ensured his victory. His enemies fled before his might, acknowledging the superiority of his fleet. As Olaf and Anund Jacob regrouped and sought to renew their strength, darker tidings reached them. Canute, relentless in his ambition, had amassed an even larger armada of 1,200 ships, intent on conquering all of Norway. Olaf's rule, harsh and unforgiving with its forced conversions and brutal suppression of the old gods, had sown the seeds of discontent among the Norwegian chiefs and nobles. Memories of Sweyn Forkbeard's reign, when paganism had been tolerated and the old gods still held sway, stirred in their hearts. Canute, ever the tactician, had sent his own spies into Norway. Armed with gold and promises, they whispered to the nobles that under Canute's rule, they could return to their old ways without fear of persecution. tempted by Canut's boundless wealth and his offer of religious freedom. The Norwegian chieftains grew hesitant to rally behind Olaf for the coming battle. They saw in Canute not only a conqueror, but a potential liberator from Olaf's oppressive hand. Thus, as the storm of war gathered once more, Olaf faced not only the threat of Canute's massive fleet, but also the threat of his own people. The fate of Norway hung in the balance, poised between the old gods and the new, between the iron rule of Olaf and the seductive power of Canute. Sigvat the Scald tells of it thus: "Our men are few, our ships are small, while England's king is strong in all. But yet our king is not afraid. Oh, never be such king betrayed. 'Tis evil counsel to deprive our king of countrymen to strive to save their country sword in hand. 'Tis money that betrays our land." After the fierce Battle of Nesjar, the tides of fortune turned against Olaf. Canute, the ever-calculating ruler of Denmark and England, landed in Norway with his seemingly boundless army, ready to lay claim to the kingdom. But Canute, wise in the ways of war and politics, knew that brute force was not the only path to power. Instead of ravaging the land, he employed a strategy of diplomacy, winning the hearts and minds of the Norwegians, who had grown angry with their king. Olaf's harsh rule and forced conversions had alienated many, and Canute was quick to exploit this resentment. Canute called for a grand thing, the ancient assembly where the kings of Norway had been crowned for generations. In this sacred gathering, beneath the weight of tradition and history, Canute asserted his claim. The thing was attended by a formidable array of Danish and English warriors, earls, chiefs and lords. Norwegian nobles and Northmen also gathered, their loyalties shifting as they watched the unfolding events. In a moment of great solemnity, Canute was chosen as the King of Norway, marking the dawn of a new era. His ascension cemented his control over a vast North Sea empire, making him the most powerful Viking in living memory, a ruler whose reach extended across England, Denmark and now Norway. Canute, ever the shrewd leader, entrusted the regency of Norway to Haakon Eriksson, the Earl of Lade, a man of noble lineage and the nephew to Svein Haakonsson. Haakon, a descendant of the legendary Haakon the Powerful, was well respected in Norway, and his appointment further solidified Canute's rule. Thus, without the need for further bloodshed, Canute had conquered Norway, not by the sword, but by the force of his will and the loyalty he inspired. King Olaf, once the fierce ruler of Norway, found himself abandoned by his people and was forced into exile. No longer welcome in his own homeland, he sought refuge in the distant lands of the Kievan Rus. During his exile, Olaf spent time in many Swedish provinces, where according to legend, he baptized many of the locals, continuing his mission to spread Christianity. But in the year 1029, fate offered him a chance to reclaim his throne. Canute's regent in Norway, Jarl Haakon Eriksson, was lost at sea, leaving a power vacuum in the kingdom. Sensing an opportunity, Olaf prepared to return to Norway and reclaim what was once his. With the backing of the Swedish king Anund Jacob, Olaf gathered his forces, determined to avoid the formidable Danish fleet guarding the port towns and cities of Norway. He led his army across the treacherous mountains, aiming to take Nidaros, the capital of Norway, by surprise in the year 1030. When Olaf landed on Norwegian soil, he was reunited with his youngest brother, Harald Sigurdsson, a boy of 15 years of age, but he was already a warrior in spirit and stature. Harald, though young, commanded respect, and he provided Olaf with a contingent of men from Ringerike, The two brothers, long separated by war and exile, reconciled with each other. For Harold, Olaf had always been a hero, and now they stood side by side, ready to face the trials that awaited them. As Olaf prepared to reclaim his kingdom, the stage was set for one final epic clash, a battle that would decide the fate of Norway and the legacy of its king. Olaf and his army would march north, their footsteps echoing through the rugged lands of Norway, until they reached Stiklestad, a farm nestled in the lower part of a valley near Trondheim. Here, beneath the brooding skies, Olaf would face his destiny in a battle that would be etched in the annals of history. The Battle of Stiklestad, fought in the year 1030. His enemy, the so-called Farmer Army, was a force of Norwegians loyal to Canute the Great, the ruler who sought to cement his hold over the land that Olaf once called his own. Olaf's men, driven by faith and loyalty, raised their voices in a thunderous battle cry. Forward, forward, men of Christ, men of the cross, men of the king. Across the field, the farmer army responded with equal fervour. Forward, forward, farmers. The clash of ideals and loyalties was about to explode into a symphony of blood and steel. Though Canute himself was absent from the battlefield, his will was enforced by the Norwegian chieftains, who stood ready to defend their land against the return of Olaf. The two forces met in a storm of chaos, the ground trembling under the weight of the warriors' charge. Swords clashed, shields splintered, the air was full of the cries of the wounded and dying. In the midst of the fray, Olaf emerged from behind his shield wall, placing himself at the head of his army. His presence was awe-inspiring, a beacon of defiance against the pagan forces that opposed him, his golden helmet gleaming under the sunlight, a symbol of his royal power, while his shield, adorned with the holy cross and trimmed with gold, shone with divine purpose. But it was his battle-axe Hel that struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. To the pagan farmers, Olaf was no mere mortal. He was a champion of the new religion, a warrior clad in the armour of Christ. Yet even legends can be overwhelmed. Amidst the swirling chaos of the battle, Olaf was beset by enemies from all sides. An axe struck his thigh, a brutal blow that brought the king to his knees. Gasping for breath, Olaf staggered towards a stone, throwing down his sword as he prayed for God's aid in his final moments. But the battle was unforgiving. Before divine intervention could come, a spear pierced through his mail coat and buried itself deep within his belly. Bloodied and broken, Olaf's strength began to fade. In his final moments, a warrior approached, his eyes cold and resolute. With a swift slash of his sword, the warrior severed Olaf's neck, and the King of Norway fell to the ground lifeless. With his death, the cause of Christ and King faltered. The once mighty army of Olaf, now leaderless, either dispersed into the wilderness or were cut down where they stood. The Battle of Stiklestad marked the end of Olaf's reign, but the legacy of the fallen king would echo through the sagas. In death, Olaf became a martyr, his story woven into the fabric of Norway's history, a tale of faith, sacrifice, and the fierce struggle for a nation's soul. Upon Olaf's death, whispers of miracles began to spread like wildfire. Among the warriors who had fought that day, one man, his hands wounded from the brutal combat, approached Olaf's lifeless body. As he wiped the blood from Olaf's cheeks, the blood trickled down his fingers, and to his astonishment, the wounds healed without needing to be bound. Some said that Olaf's power transcended death. After the Battle of Stiklestad, Olaf's body was placed in a humble hut. Beggars and the poor had followed the armies in hopes of scraps of food, and they lingered nearby. One blind man, weary and desperate, stumbled into the hut seeking refuge. The cold, damp floor offered him little comfort, but as he lay there, he felt moisture beneath him. He rubbed his eyes with his wet hands, but soon realized he would find no sleep in the wet, damp hut. So he stumbled out, but something had changed. His sight had returned. He looked down and saw his hands were stained red with Olaf's blood, the very blood that had restored his vision. News of these miracles reached far and wide, and soon the Archbishop Grimketel was summoned to Norway. Upon hearing the stories and witnessing the healed and the blessed, Grimketel declared Olaf a saint, the first sainted king of Norway. Olaf, who had died as a king in battle, was reborn as a martyr and as a beacon of faith. 40 years after his death, in the year 1070, Olaf's legacy had only grown stronger. His shrine in Nidaros became a sacred pilgrimage site, drawing the faithful from every corner of the Norse world. He was now known as Norway's eternal king, and churches bearing his name sprang up across the land, even reaching the distant Iceland, Sweden, and Finland. His influence crossed the seas, with even churches in England dedicated to his memory. As the centuries passed, Olaf's story transformed into legend. He became not just a king, but a slayer of trolls and giants, a protector against dark forces. His healing powers attracted pilgrims to his shrine. Today, Olaf stands as Norway's patron saint, enshrined in Nidaros Cathedral, one of the most revered figures in the nation's history. Yet, the historical Olaf is a figure shrouded in contradictions. By the accounts of his time, he was a tyrant, a ruler who betrayed his own kin. He wiped out the Norse petty kings and deceived those who trusted him. He waged a brutal campaign to force the pagans to convert to Christianity, with his methods being ruthless, his reign marked by violence and fanaticism. But as time passed, the harshness of his rule faded from memory, and only the saintly legacy endured. Olaf's lineage did not die with him. His son Magnus the Good would reclaim the Norwegian crown, and his younger brother Harald Sigurdsson, better known as Harald Hardrada, would continue the saga of their dynasty, forging his own legendary path. I would like to give a huge thank you to all of my members. Your contribution is valuable to the continuation of the channel, and I appreciate you all immensely. A special thank you to John Seitz and Stephanie Hassan. I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to like, subscribe and share, and I'll see you all soon for another History Profile.